Hello, friends. How are you? Welcome to Vinyl Junkies. On this episode of Digging the Bins, we will be talking about the life and music of Frank Sinatra. I'll focus mostly on his earlier years and his middle years, the capital years, because, in my opinion, they're the most interesting ones. But we will go through his entire career. Obviously, with the life of Frank Sinatra, we're not going to be able to cover very much, but we'll see what kind of stories we can get in the next hour. I'm very happy to have you guys along. Hope you're enjoying yourselves. Um, Stay tuned next week. By the way, hey, share this episode. There are prizes coming up. It's just a question of actually getting let you know. Jesus, is this recording? I never know if it's recording or not. I'm hoping that my wife finally gets back to me. Looks and sounds good, she says. Awesome. Thank you, Ariel Mingus. You rule. So the deal is that we're going to talk about Frank Sinatra. Before that, by the way, do you like this? Do you know anybody who likes Sinatra or would probably like at least a primer on his life or what records to buy? Then this would be the episode for you. We were supposed to do metal, but that didn't happen, and I really love making plans with people and then just watching them not happen. Flakes really, I love flakes. So next week we might have a jazz episode, and it'll be Matt Block of Run Out Groove's chance to flake out at the last minute. And if he doesn't do that, then we're going to talk about jazz, plus the gift show that I've been talking to you about. The gift show will give you a bunch of things that you can either ask for or gift to other people, stocking stuffers and such. We're going to feature some speakers by Canto Living, some headphones by a company from Denmark called AI. A-I-A-I-O. So we're going to talk about that. And we should be getting some box sets also to talk about. So imagine that. Those of you, as you know, it's stocking stuffer season. So box sets always work. I know that, hey man, if somebody bought me a box set for Christmas, I would be happy. This is the time when all of that stuff comes out, so we'll see if we can parse through a couple of those, and until then, we will talk about jazz. By the way, look out for the banner on our little show, the Impulse Bundle. Folks, I've been teasing about that in the group. Put out a little poll asking, hey, if I can get you exclusive stuff, good prices, and all the rest of this, would you be interested? I picked out an impulse bundle through the Vinyl Me Please shop, and there are 50 of them that will go on sale. That, boom, that right there. Alice Coltrane, Archie Shepp, Max Roach. They're going to be going on sale at a special price for you vinyl junkies, so stay tuned for that. You want them. They're not going to be around for long. We'll snap them up. And with that, Sinatra. It's funny, whenever... Oh, great, my cat's meowing. We're going to be hearing from Anthrax. Whenever it is that I'm caught at the last minute with having to just make a show up on the fly, I always wind up going to... I guess my go-to topics, or the topics that I consider to be just, they've been with me my entire life, I've listened to the music for so long and read so much about the stuff that it kind of becomes part of DNA. So, thankfully I have a couple of those things. Sinatra is definitely one of those. So I thought I'd give it an overview. One of the reasons I wanted to do that is because, well, you can talk to older people and sure, they know Sinatra, but the fact is with the world moving as fast as it is, and with vinyl, new audiences coming to vinyl, and the reason I call it new audiences is because the people that are buying, the young people that are buying vinyl today didn't grow up with it. It is a new format for all intents and purposes for them. So, I thought to myself, okay, well, when you're talking about an artist who's, enjoyed his heyday during the 40s and 50s and 60s, maybe an overview would help. It's like the guy's got literally hundreds of records, hundreds. He's recorded thousands of songs. So, how do you parse all that out? Thankfully for you, dear friends, I am a lifelong Sinatra file and have been obsessively collecting him for 30 years or such. And read a bunch of books, and we'll go into that. Why Sinatra? Well, as I put this up, as I was kind of just thinking, okay, fuck, what do I talk about? What do I talk about this week? You know, metal didn't happen, so what do I talk about? As I was saying, okay, Sinatra, I can do this. And I just put it up, and I think, you know, the description was pretty simple. We'll talk about what the hell did I say anyway? The life of times of Frank Sinatra. And one guy commented, it's like, well, why would, you know, I don't understand why anybody would listen to Sinatra. He didn't have anything special to his voice and only sang songs that were sung, but that were written by someone else. You know, and I guess you hear a comment like that, and I mean, look, the guy's an imbecile, obviously, for making a comment like that, and more likely than not, he's a young person, either too young or too ignorant to realize that once upon a time, artists did not write their own songs. They were two different classes, right? There was the people who wrote the songs, and there were the people who interpreted the song. So, to discount any artist for that would have to be to discount pretty much any singer from that time, including Billie Holiday and Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong and even the blues singers. So people who talk about it, you're not really a musician unless you write your own songs, are fucking idiots. People who think that if you're not playing an instrument, it's not music, they're also fucking idiots, because an instrument is whatever you make it. So, Sinatra. Born in Hoboken, New Jersey. Young kid, the son of immigrant parents. Now, I think one of the reasons that I connect so closely to the life and the music of Sinatra is because he is of Italian extraction. He is of Italian origin. And although obviously there's a huge generational gap between Sinatra and what he grew up with and what I grew up with, there is one thing that we do have in common. There is one thing that we do share in common. And if you speak to anybody, I think it would be the case, just the immigrant experience in general. There is that immigrant experience of being the first generation born in a new country. Okay, so Frank's parents, Nancy Barbato was his wife, I believe. No, was that his? Geez, no, of course not. That's his first wife, Nancy Barbato. His wife, his mother, who used to be, they used to nickname Dottie, and father, were born in Italy, came here, settled in. Sinatra was born in Hoboken, New Jersey, and was a scrawny little kid, and actually suffered an injury as he was being removed from his mom's womb. They needed to use forceps in order to pull him out. These forceps pierced one of his eardrums and caused scarring along the side of his face. And the problem that he had with the eardrums was just his eardrum was damaged his whole life. And he was a pretty scrawny kid. Now, where I talk about how I relate to that experience is just the experience of being the first generation born of immigrant parents. You see it with the life of Sinatra. You see it in movies like Scorsese, those Italian mob Scorsese movies, or The Godfather and everything. And although a lot of people watch this and that shit happens, our families were really like that. The moms were strong figures. And Sinatra was very, very, very affected by his early life. His mom was a very strong woman, Dottie. And so much so that she used to raise money for, local shelters and just be a hugely influential person in the political sphere. Now, it was also said through this book, this salacious book called His Way, the Unauthorized Biography of Frank Sinatra. There were a bunch of stories here. I'll be getting back to this book on a few occasions, but Kitty Kelly, the person who wrote that book, basically she is the 80s version of TMZ, or, trash journalism. But it did make for a good book. It did make for a good read, and what's true and what's not is, look, there's no way we can know it, right? But I did read it, and there was rumor of Frank's mom actually performing, abortions for young Italian girls who couldn't have a child out of wedlock and bring shame to the family. And I think she had earned the nickname, purportedly, of Hatpin Dottie or something like that, Hatpin Dolly, which was some reference to these illegal abortions. Now, whether that's true or not is up for discussion. Sinatra's father was a guy who basically shifted from job to job, and the history seems to suggest that he wasn't a very strong, he wasn't of a strong character. His mother, Dottie, really just wore, Dottie or Dolly? Jesus, I don't even remember. I've read these books a long time ago, but let's hope that they still translate into good stories, okay? You guys can feel free and add some comments for yourself if you see that I'm going off the wrong path. But yeah, it just seemed like his mom is the one who wore the pants in the house, so to speak. And his relationship with his father did box lightweight, I believe, for a little while, and worked on the docks. New Jersey, the docks. Tommy used to work on the docks. Very, very much like a John Bon Jovi would do generations later. He was halfway there. You know how? Living on a prayer. And so Sinatra, like a lot of kids that age, and actually it was the case also for us growing up Italian, made money wherever he could. So pick up jobs here and there, and very much like communities that stuck together. This person would tell him to go do this job and that job. Godfather, for those of you who've watched enough movies, and those of you who understand the Roman Catholic religion, being a godfather to somebody is really a very big deal as well. So those old relationships that came from the old country were still very, very much in effect, including relationships of the not so legal type. So throughout this conversation, I wouldn't be surprised if I bring up mob ties, and it's neither here nor there, but let's see what comes out. Honestly, dudes, this hour can go in a bunch of different directions because there's so much to talk about. So the fun part about it is that we can talk more than once about Sinatra. I'll probably wind up getting to the same things and mentioning the same things, but in a different way. So there will be repetition. And I wouldn't rely on my facts too much. My memory is horrible. Don't forget, I am a stoner. So, one of the things that he would do is he immediately took to music. He didn't have any musical training. Jesus Christ, I'm still 14 minutes in, and we're still at Sinatra as a kid. He hasn't even started his career yet. This is going well, isn't it? He wasn't, my cat's destroying something. He wasn't trained by any stretch of the imagination. As a matter of fact, as his parents were kind of doing one job to the other, his mother exercised her character and influence. They also owned a family tavern, and it is in this tavern that Sinatra, would sing sometimes. And yes, buddy, I'm not opening the door for you. And he would, at one point, I think there was a radio show. I'm going to go there. Okay, why don't I go there? There was a radio show, and on this radio show, people can just basically audition in order to win a prize. And there were some friends, there were some local Italian people or friends, youngsters, called the Hoboken Three, that seemed to be getting a little bit of a reputation around the area. And again, very cultural. Cultures stick together. Okay, especially when they're coming to a new country before they develop their own identity and before they really just mix in and kind of like fit the landscape. What they do is they do stick together, and that closeness gives them the connection before they're able to forge other connections in their new country. And so this happened. Now Sinatra was very, very much a huge super fan of music. So his mom, Dottie, she must have bothered him at some point and said, "Listen, I want to be able to do this." And she would, on the one hand, really berate her son and treat him cruelly, and on the other hand, just try to bring him up by giving him a bunch of money so he can dress really sharp. So Sinatra's love of clothes and Sinatra's sharp style started from the very, very, very beginning before he ever was a star, and was very much something that was encouraged by his mom. So Hoboken 3 eventually becomes Hoboken 4 through a bunch of strings being pulled here and there. This Godfather speaks to that Godfather, and what winds up happening is, as he sees these other three kids, I mean, they were his age, he was almost reverential to them, because that was his relationship with music early on. He loved music that much. So anybody close to it is something he revered. Now, what wound up happening is, as they would go around performing for these radio contests, because they were local performances, Sinatra started catching all of the attention. Now, it's not because he was, he had boyish good looks or anything like that. If anything, he was a pretty awkward kid, skinny, not too strong, these big floppy ears. But he had a certain vulnerability to him. Like, he had a certain runtiness to him, but he had a certain vulnerability to him that made people attracted to him. Now, we're going to put a little bit of time, a little bit of history in this to kind of see what happens. With the Hoboken 4, he winds up winning this radio contest and becomes so popular that the guy who had the radio contest tried to get the Hoboken 4 to keep coming back over and over again to the show under different names. And so he would win contests over and over again, but basically it was the same band. I can't find the names. I made a bunch of notes and I'm just going to wing it, okay, because the writing is way too small. But from there, the bug really hit him. So he tried to sing. Every chance he could, he tried to get as close to music as possible. So much so that he would get his start singing in dinner clubs for cigarette money. He didn't care, because he saw it as an opportunity to practice his craft and for him to just impose himself, put himself in the scene, and then let just the sheer will of his passion and his character, because he did have a very, very strong temperamental character, which he took after his mother. There was a push-pull type dynamic between him and his mother that really gave him quite a tempestuous character. So he'd start off singing for cigarette money, Eventually gets found by Harry James. So his first professional gig is with the Harry James Orchestra, and from there, basically, his career started. And this was early on, I think in the early 40s, I would say. And he did record some sides with Harry James, but it's only after he left Harry James's orchestra and joined the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra that he really started taking off. Now here, we're going to get into a couple of really interesting things, because firstly, there's a fun story connected to, anytime you mention the mob, it's always fun. Mob and Italians, it's fun, but there's a fun story attached to that whole sequence with the Harry James Orchestra and him going to Tommy Dorsey, because you see, it wasn't as simple as that. Harry James, I believe, owns something like 60% of his earnings or something. He, like, the types of deals that you would see in music all the time. And he wanted to record with Dorsey, but Harry James wouldn't let him out of his contract. So what wound up happening is, at one point, from a contentious type of thing, and Frank Sinatra would suffer many contentious relationships because he was very much the type of person who spoke plainly and pissed people off for it. Combined with a temper, that's not a good thing. But it went from a contentious type of battle, one of the first of many feuds between Sinatra and a bunch of other people, and from that, suddenly Harry James just relents and lets him out of the contract amicably, so that he can go on and record with Tommy Dorsey. And with Tommy Dorsey, winds up making something like $400 a week or $450 a week, which was, a handsome sum back in the 40s, right? But obviously, if you watched The Godfather, there are many allusions to the character, especially of Johnny Fontane, being associated to the story of Sinatra. So the first part of that story would be how the mob did or did not speak to Harry James and make him a quote-unquote offer he couldn't refuse, right? So he was let out of the contract. He goes to Tommy Dorsey, and now if we have to put things in historical perspective, this is around wartime. So a lot of men are off serving for World War II. Sinatra could not contribute to participate. He couldn't go to war. His ear was all fucked up, and supposedly in his record also, it said that he didn't exactly have the best temperament. So from a psychological perspective, he was probably considered too crazy to go to war anyway. But see, the reason it is that I mentioned that is because the way all of this happened was, in the time, a lot of music was happening. Music wasn't really something that was disseminated through radio. A lot of people would listen to music by going and watch live bands perform. So the big band era is what we're talking about. And Sinatra did get a start with the big band era. Tommy Dorsey, Jimmy Dorsey, big band. Harry James, big band. So what would happen is that he would record in New Jersey, and he had a certain vulnerability to him. He had a certain sweetness to his voice, and he had a certain longing to his voice also that connected with the mostly female people in the crowd. And he basically created one of the biggest movements in music, one of the earliest for sure, which is the Bobby Sox movement. So when you're talking about boy bands, I think it is probably safe to assume that Frank Sinatra was the first boy band. Frank Sinatra was Justin Bieber, way before Justin Bieber ever existed. Now, because a lot of the men were out to war, women were at home, and they'd go out and they'd party, and they'd go to these sock hops. So that's where the term Bobby Soxers came from, because the style of the day was the poodle skirt. So they would wear skirts, some of them with a little poodle on it, but they would have their socks rolled down. But the reason it was called Bobby Soxers is because at these dances, okay, a lot of the time they wouldn't let you come in with your shoes because the shoes would scuff up the floors. So you would have to take off your shoes and dance in your socks. That's where the term sock hop comes from. Okay, it was all an effort to basically protect the floors. So these Bobby Soxers, with their boyfriends and husbands out serving their country, would show up en masse to watch Sinatra sing these songs of love and longing and connect with him to the point where they would go completely fucking bonkers. We're talking about Beatlemania before Beatlemania. We're talking about Elvis Presley before Elvis Presley. This is the first. It's the first. In terms of recorded music, that was it, man. The original OG was Sinatra, and he was a teen idol. And, there's one story that I read just earlier today about how it was just a pretty normal thing for him to, do 3, 4, 5 shows in the same day, as it was with a lot of artists. But the deal there was that in his case, it would cause riots because 300 people would show up for the first show and, at a 300 capacity theater. But as the fifth show rolled around, he'd have thousands of people waiting outside who had either come out of the show and were coming down from the excitement of having their hormones fucking slung to by this young kid. So they kind of like stuck around for the other shows outside in the afterglow, or there were people who couldn't get into the subsequent shows. So Sinatra shows used to cause riots. It was a big deal. That was the Columbia years. Now, I guess if we go into the Columbia years, I do have some of these records, and a lot of that stuff was mostly on 78. So if you're looking for old if you're looking for old Sinatra music, his first real contracted music was with Columbia, and you'll see that he sings in a very different way than what you might be used to a little later on, like the guy who said, Jesus, I'm burping up my supper. I'm sorry. Delicious supper. Fucking teriyaki turkey, but it's just, I'm burping it all up. So rude of me. Now I'm thinking about turkey. So a lot of the early records were the Columbia years. And during that time, the LP hadn't really come into place. So records came out in 78. And you know what? Now I'm going to go into a little bit more of a history, and I'll tell you that what I'm holding here, this is a book of 78s. This is literally an example of how the term album came out, because these 78s used to be sold individually. So, I mean, they look like that. This is an original Columbia Sinatra 78. I got another dozen of them about. But what would happen is, because they were sold separately like this, they would eventually, a lot of them, to encourage people to buy the same is, see, in this case it's RCA Victor, you don't see it in the camera, but they would release these albums that looked like picture albums and were made like picture albums, so that you can store all of your records and you can put them on the shelf very much in the same place as you would put your picture albums. So that's really where the term album originated. The original album jackets weren't the album jackets that we saw, because albums didn't exist. It was 78s. So they would sell 78s, and this was the album, in which you could add a bunch of other things. Sorry, it's really heavy, and I don't want to ruin my records. I mean, I got a bunch of old jazz 78s in there that, Billie Holiday, Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, good stuff. I don't want to destroy my records. I like you, but I can't go do show and tell. It's too heavy. Now, the LP obviously changed things a little bit, and I guess this is where I get to this wonderful LP. This is the very first record ever put out by Sinatra that wasn't just a single released on 78. This was on 33, lovingly recreated by our friends at Light in the Attic. And it's his first record. His first record was called The Voice of Frank Sinatra. So for those of you who have seen his many nicknames, his very first nickname was not Old Blue Eyes. It wasn't Chairman of the Board. It was The Voice, because it came straight from this record, The Voice. Now, try to find originals. It's not going to happen. I'm really happy that those came out. VMP made a series of 3,000, which aren't in the store anymore, so I guess they're all sold out. What you'll notice also is that the album art does nothing special. That is because album art did not exist at the time either. Don't forget, there were no albums. There were 78s, and the 78s were just released in these sleeves, which may have had advertising in them, but for the most part they didn't. So this is where it is that you start getting into LPs. So the idea of album art can't exist if there's no albums. That's coming later. It does come later as the album format takes over a little bit more. Are you guys enjoying this? Should I be taking the time to like maybe read comments or something? The fact is, yeah, everything's fucked over here. The fact is that my internet doesn't seem to be working the way it is that I want to, so I can't read your comments. So I'm going to just assume that you like it. If you do like it, why don't you give me a like? And why don't you share, man? That would be a good thing. I think the thing I like most about doing these shows with you guys is the back and forth and hearing that the stories connect with other people. Hearing that, hey, I never fucking thought about this record this way. I'm going to go out and get it. Right? So, to get to the Columbia years, and I'm closing up on that period, and then we're getting really into the meat. Okay? If you're trying to buy Columbia records, Sinatra, that would be the early stuff, the Bobby Sox era. That's after Tommy Dorsey, though. But you're not going to find albums. For the most part, a lot of that stuff came out on Shellacs, 78s, but there are some of them, okay, of which this here, The Voice of Frank Sinatra, is one of them. Good luck finding an original. I have not succeeded. But I do have a box set of his complete Columbia recordings, and Columbia represented the first period of his career, but it represented not only the meteoric rise of his career, because he was very much the first pop superstar, but it also, his life as a Columbia artist was fucking Icarus, basically. It's the story of Icarus, you know? Again, I keep mentioning that he was a very mercurial guy with a temper and everything, so very often got caught up with his emotions and got into fights. So, and because he was as passionate as he was, he let that speak. He ran hot. Okay, now, what happens during this time, during these Columbia years, are a variety of things. Number one, he starts, his bread and butter are young teenage kids, right? So what happens, by the end of his Columbia years, what I'm trying to say here is that you couldn't give his records away. As a matter of fact, the person running Columbia used to say, well, I can't even give Sinatra records away. How did that happen? There's a series of missteps that happen, which we'll go through, okay? The first thing that winds up happening is he gets a little big for his britches, okay, which is to say that he is so enraptured by all of this and he gets so caught up in the emotion of all of this that he really stretches out and basically wants to do more than he should be doing. Okay, so his bread and butter were romantic songs, you know, sung towards young ladies. That was his audience. So all of a sudden, what it is that he wanted to do was start recording orchestral music and music that wasn't geared towards his core audience. So it's kind of like if Justin Bieber decides to do a jazz album out of nowhere, you know? It didn't really go anywhere. So he was kind of starting to branch out because he took himself as seriously as he did as an artist. Although he had no vocal training, he tried really hard, and he was a workaholic, so he learned on the job very much. What it is that he would do is try things that didn't fit his MO and didn't work. Another thing that wound up happening is as he became more popular, war was over. The men started coming back. Girls went and hang out with their boys. So that longing, that sense of longing that the music of Sinatra and the shows of Sinatra would fill, that void that was filled, was no longer needed anymore. So he fell out of favor for that reason as well. And then I would say thirdly, what is thirdly? Am I going to remember? I'll get to it eventually. Yeah. The whole Italian thing started coming out. As he became more popular, you know, people started taking a little bit of pot shots and everything. So at this point, his mother's connections and his connections to the mob kind of sort of started coming up. People started asking questions, you know. That led him to do something pretty weird. He played a priest in a movie and decided, like, as a not a PR move, but just as, yeah, I guess a PR move, really, not for popularity, but just kind of like to let people know that he was still a mom and apple pie kind of guy. He played a priest. The thing is by playing a priest in a movie, again, if his audience is young teenage girls who miss their boyfriends, he's not hitting the target, right? And he gave his money to this Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church very much played a part in his at least cultural upbringing for a long time. He had such an adoration for Tommy Dorsey that Tommy Dorsey was godfather to Nancy Sinatra, just to give you an idea. And for, those who might say, oh, well, he really just kind of talked over music that wasn't written by others, like that imbecile. You see, that there were different periods of Sinatra's music. The reprise years were different. That's where his timbre kind of became a little bit loamier, a little darker. But early on, it wasn't that at all. As a matter of fact, if anything, he had such range in his voice, and he had such dexterity in his voice, because he practiced something that he learned from Tommy Dorsey, and he revolutionized the way vocalists sang, because he was the first person who did something called circular breathing and adopted it to singing. Okay, because what he would do is, as he was playing, he would pay attention to Dorsey and notice that this guy can go on forever. He can just sustain notes forever. It just looks like he's never taking a breath. And he noticed next to the bandstand that what Dorsey was doing was kind of taking these mini breaths, okay, which allowed him to keep going and which allowed him to sustain, which he started doing vocally. And as far as I know, he's the first person to really do that. But that was a big deal. So much so that if you talk to, but if you read up on Miles Davis utilized the same type of circular breathing in his trumpet. And, from the various books that I've read, I'm not saying I'm right, I didn't know the guy or anything, but just like Sinatra gave all the credit to Dorsey, Miles Davis gave the credit to Sinatra for teaching him this idea of circular breathing. So there was very much a big technical thing. Now, as all of this is going on, like I said, plays a priest, he alienates his audience. Men come back from war, the audience isn't as interested, the crowds are going down. There's competition for the same type of music, so even though he set the groundwork, all of a sudden there were other people trying to go for the same slice of pie. All this is to say that he became less and less popular, and all of a sudden couldn't fill his venues anymore. So he'd be playing venues that could fit 2,000 people, and only 150 people showed up. So much so that the head of Columbia, and this was really one of the things considered the low point of Sinatra's career, or one of them at least, was they didn't give a fuck about him or his artistry. They wanted to sell records, and they saw that it's just everything was going on a downfall. What it is that they would do is they got him to sing a song called Mama Will Bark, which is, if you speak to Sinatra files, the low point in his career. What this is basically a novelty song. Novelty songs were a big deal, but no real singer would sing novelty songs. This was really just sell a couple of records. It was a cheap shtick. So there was this buxom, platinum blonde actress comedian named Dagmar that was very much along the vein, very much a direct ripoff of people like Mae West and so forth, right? So Dagmar, and she had this kind of little comedy shtick on TV, and they got Frank Sinatra to sing this song called Mama Will Bark about a dog with Dagmar, who was a Z-level celebrity whose claim to fame was her platinum blonde hair and her boobs. And during this song, it's a dreadful piece of music, but I'm really happy it exists. I like it. Dagmar is basically talking her part, so Mama will bark, Mama, and then like Sinatra would sing his little part, then Papa will bark, and during the song, it's the first time that you hear kind of they have a sound of a dog howling and barking in the background piped in. I don't remember exactly how that went, but it was the first time that they had that. Obviously, I'm assuming they didn't have the dog in studio, and the dog's not going to bark or howl right on cue. So it was piped in. I don't know the technology back then. I mean, it's a long time ago, but all this is to say that he went from being a big something to a big nothing, and was summarily let out of his Columbia contract by that point. Now, he had become popular. So what was happening at this point was, even though he was down in the dumps, now we're getting to the juicy stuff, the really, really good stuff. The capital years is where you want to concentrate with Frank Sinatra. Even though, no matter what happens to Justin Bieber, he's hot now. So he attracts all the hot girls. So he still had that cachet. His career was in the dumps, but he still had that cachet, and had a tempestuous love affair with Ava Gardner, a very attractive, very talented, very popular actress of the 50s that was popular, before Marilyn Monroe for sure. Just, one of those classic bombshells. And during this time, she had a successful Hollywood career, and Sinatra was still married. So this was another way that his career took a complete beating, right? Because during this entire time, one of the things that made him attractive to these young ladies was the fact that he was forbidden fruit, because it kind of alleviated their own guilt about longing for someone that wasn't their partner who was off to war, because Sinatra was a married man and he had a kid. So he had this wholesome image that was being tarnished. This didn't help by the fact that, he had the reputation of being a womanizer, and in this particular case was kind of making the papers for his fling with Ava Gardner, mostly because they were both very mercurial as characters, so they would have blowout fights. This was fodder for the National Enquirers of the day, Variety magazine, or whatever the case is. They loved these kind of stories, right? Sold a lot of newspapers. So he fell out of favor for that because he was just seen as a scumbag. It's like, even though, cheating on your wife and all the rest of this was considered a much more normal boys will be boys kind of thing, it was still, boys will be boys, but you're still a scumbag kind of thing. So it ruined his rep a little. It didn't help at all. It took years for him to get divorced from his first wife, Nancy Barbado, because she didn't want to get divorced from him. She was Roman Catholic and very much was anti-divorce because her religion forbade it. So he basically carried on with Ava Gardner for years in plain view while being married to his first wife, Nancy. And Nancy was a high school sweetheart. So this led him to be really, really depressed. And he wore his heart on his sleeve, so his emotions used to carry him a lot. And it was a time of great turmoil. And there's a whole lot of stories that are attached here. This is an interesting period of Frank's life, because I think that it's this turmoil and sadness that caused him to create the greatest music of his career, really the greatest music of his career. And we go back to the Godfather. During his time with Ava Gardner, eventually, by the way, Nancy relented and granted him his divorce, and it cost him a fortune. So that's another thing that put this huge pressure on him, because it was a high, very, very much a high profile divorce, especially at the time where divorce was not prominent. And he needed money to pay for that. And the head of Columbia basically said, I can't even give your records away. So there was a big problem there. Add to that the fact that I guess he felt a little bit emasculated because Ava, they did eventually get married. As soon as basically they got married immediately after The ink wasn't even dry on the divorce papers with Nancy, and they got married, kind of deal. It really happened that quickly, and Ava had no trouble with her career at all. She was a high flying actress, so it was very humiliating for him to be a washed up uh, former teen heartthrob, and it hurt him, and so much so that if you follow Kitty Kelly's book, and if you believe what it is that she says, she did put a couple of stories together, but there's this oft described fight, this huge blowout fight that happened in Hawaii between Ava Gardner and Sinatra, where she was working. She was on set working, and he went there, and again felt kind of a bit humiliated because his woman was working and he was not. He was just basically, he was the tag along. But this started leading to their eventual downfall in terms of their relationship, and he got so despondent that he supposedly tried to commit suicide. Now, I'm not sure if that's true or not, but it's out there. I don't know the guy personally. So, what happens here is where we start getting back into the Godfather of things. We'll get to the story of Johnny Fontane from The Godfather. If you remember the story of Johnny Fontane from The Godfather, the book was written by Mario Puzo, right? That's a great story. The story there is directly it is supposed to be a direct allusion to two events in Sinatra's life. The first event was how the mob did or didn't cause Harry James to amicably terminate Sinatra's contract. And the second one is Sinatra's role in the movie From Here to Eternity, a movie that eventually won him an Oscar. Now, during this time, it was Sinatra connected with the role for the movie From Here to Eternity, and knew that if he played this, he was perfect for the part, and it would just rejuvenate his career, would kickstart his career, and he needed that very, very, very badly. And the head of the studio wouldn't give it to him, so there we start getting into the Mario Puzo comparison, where you make him an offer you can't refuse, and you wake up with your horse's head beside you, and then all of a sudden he becomes the star for this movie, where the answer was no, 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 you're not going to get this role. To all of a sudden he got the role, and he wins the Oscar, and it winds up turning out for him exactly the way he had hoped, and his career just jumped way back up. He just got that spark again. But rolling back to the Godfather thing, the Johnny Fontane story is very much that. So much so. Wow, man, we may need to do a part 2. We've gone through 48 minutes. Are you enjoying this? So much so that there's a story that goes around that when Puzo's book The Godfather came out, Sinatra was furious about it, absolutely furious about it. And he lived in LA, so at one point supposedly there was some party happening that was held by a millionaire, and Puzo was invited to go to this party, a very exclusive party, and Sinatra was there. Now, nobody knew of any friction, and nobody knew exactly how Sinatra felt about all of this, but Sinatra was never one to keep his tongue, right? So supposedly this millionaire, who's unnamed, tried to introduce Puzo with Sinatra, and Sinatra's at the table eating, right? So Sinatra never takes his plate, never stops eating, just never acknowledges him, and basically just keeps eating. And I think you're smart putting this in a book. What is it? Your publishers told you that you put this? Where did you get this idea? All this, never looking at him, just always eating. And he had told his millionaire friends, no, this is not somebody that I want to meet. This is a pimp.
in the sense that he's pimping out ideas, kind of thing. So it was, he basically told Puzo to go fuck himself in the most polite way possible. Now, even though Sinatra was known to be somebody who could curse a blue streak, supposedly that's not what happened. The worst name he called him was a pimp, but basically made him understand you're nothing. That kind of thing. You are not even worthy of me taking my eyes off my food. So that's basically the backstory of Sinatra where it concerns the Godfather and Puzo directly. So he wins an Oscar for From Here to Eternity, and then suddenly gets offered a contract at Capitol Records. The Capitol building was a new building, but from there started recording the music. I think that I definitely consider the Capitol years to be his finest recorded output, and it started with this here, a 10-inch called Swing Easy, that saw him in another collaboration with somebody that would be his partner for a while, Nelson Riddle. Nelson Riddle I'm a master orchestrator, so he'd conduct a lot of his swingier stuff and a lot of his kind of like up-tempo music, and they developed such a synergy to them within each other that those two names became intermingled for a long time. Now, one thing that Nelson Riddle didn't like is that Sinatra, although he didn't know how to read music, he was always very implicated, and he kind of like he had a strong intuition for what works and what didn't work. So he would often interfere with Nelson Riddle's orchestrations and say, no, try this and try that. He'd always implicate himself into the work. And I mean, Nelson Riddle hated it, but he would eventually kind of like concede, for a fucker who doesn't know how to read music, he's really got a good idea of what works and what doesn't. So this was the first one, and it did well. But where it is that I think it got super interesting, and where it is that I think arguably Sinatra released the first concept album, is right here. In the Wee Small Hours. Now, with this record, it should be said that a lot of these this is the kind of music I call sad bastard music. Okay, and Sinatra was very much one of those guys who could sing a ballad better than anyone else, because you can literally hear the guy cry almost. He just really knew how to get to the heart of the emotion that you're supposed to be feeling. He had loved and he had lost, and the fact is that Nelson Riddle had even said as much, and other biographers, his constant fights with Ava Gardner fucked him up, and they weren't faithful to each other. Like I said, all of this was really played out in the tabloids. So she was fucking a flamenco guitarist from Spain, and he was fucking someone else, and there was this big fight, and there was no fidelity, and it was destroying him from the inside. And it's certainly been suggested that that's really the kind of raw emotion. Of course, now if he tried to commit suicide, that would add an extra element to it. Again, I don't know if it's true or not, but it sort of makes you understand why people connect to the sadness of some of Sinatra's ballads. And this here is considered, if not the very first, one of the very first concept albums. And by concept albums, what they mean is that Sinatra just chose his songs in a way that took advantage of the album format, so that he ran it around a theme. Okay, so swing albums is one thing, because swing albums, there's no concept behind a swing album, because a swing album is meant to make you dance. But in this particular case, he'd be singing about sadness, and he'd be singing about glad to be unhappy, I get along without you very well, can't we be friends, when your lover has gone. So a whole bunch of songs about having loved and lost. And It was an enormously popular record, and I could not suggest it more. To me, this is one of the this you need this Sinatra record in the wee small hours if you have to get any. Now, a big part of Sinatra's capital years was split between making swing music and making these kind of mournful ballad type records. So you'll see a lot of swing records that come out here. Let me see if I can pull them out. I didn't put them in order. Here we go. So yeah, there's a lot of swing records, and most of the swing records, he did with Nelson Riddle, but he did a couple also with Billy May Orchestra, and a few others. But you'll find "Come Dance with Me." This is another one of the big records that he did with Billy May. But again, like I said, swing orchestras, because he was somebody who very, very, very much wanted to sing live and very much believed in being a part of this big musical happening, So for him, live recording was a big thing, and he was always very much into the big orchestrations, and a lot of money and budget was spent on his records. And I mean, he sold a lot of records. So "Come Dance" would be another one that follows that type of concept here. "Song for Swingin' Lovers" is more of the typical swing thing, where it's kind of like, oh, these are the types of records that'll sell. You'll find that there's a lot of records from Sinatra with the word swing in them during this time. So Sinatra's Swingin' Session is another one. All great records. Basically, what I'm trying to tell you is anything released by Sinatra on Capitol is good. All of it. All of it. I've heard all of it. Get it if you see it. Okay, these are the individual albums. What I'll do is I'll point one out to you that's maybe a little bit of an anomaly, and you didn't even know. Here's another one close to you. Okay. Here's one that maybe you didn't know, but there's a record that he released called "Tone Poems of Color." Okay. As I've mentioned, he saw himself, as much as he wasn't a trained musician, he saw himself as a serious musician. He took his craft very, very seriously, and he learned within what he knew. So every time he got to a certain level where he can allow himself, where he can exercise an influence which allowed him to do things that were outside the normal range, he would do that. So he released this record called "Tone Poems of Color," which is Sinatra basically conducting an orchestra, and it features no singing at all. So yeah, Sinatra has recorded records with no singing. As a matter of fact, he's recorded 3 records with no singing, this of which is the first. "Tone Poems of Color." So every song is basically he worked with a variety of orchestra conductors to convey different colors. So he would say, all right, you do this color, you do that color, and the music would kind of fit that. So there's Nelson Riddle on this, there's Billy May, Gordon Jenkins, so the big guys are there. Elmer Bernstein is even on this, as a matter of fact. He does silver. Andre Previn, which is more known in the classical circles, but Sinatra was a very big fan of classical music. It's what he would listen to on his spare time, or a lot of it. So yeah, "Tone Poems of Color" is the Sinatra record that has no singing. I'm going to stop at the Capitol years, man. Let's see. The other big Sad Bastard record, in my opinion, actually, it's my favorite Sad Bastard record from the Capitol years, is only Frank Sinatra sings for "Only the Lonely." This is the most amazing record, and just really the saddest record. If it understands heartbreak as well as anything, and this one's arranged by Nelson Riddle and conducted by Nelson Riddle as well, and it's got probably my favorite song on this, which is "One for My Baby" and "One More for the Road." Listen to the words, listen to the song. It's goosebump inducing, and this song and a lot of songs on this album wound up being songs that would be a regular staple of the bar room portion of Sinatra's shows where he would just kind of like take this mood and kind of like get into this contemplative bar uh vibe. So One for My Baby became one of those songs. Only the Lonely became one of those songs. Guess I'll Hang My Tears Out to Dry became one of those, and so forth. Now, he here, you want another concept album, and this is a huge concept album. Again, just to reinforce the idea that concept albums existed far before uh, prog rock made its appearance on the music scene. Here's one in which every single song is about flying somewhere. He basically wanted this album to sound like a musical travelogue. He called it a musical travelogue. So every song takes you somewhere, to Brazil and to Hawaii and to Mandalay, Isle of Capri, April in Paris, autumn in New York. Can't possibly suggest it more. And I guess where it is that I'll end is here. You want a Christmas record? This would be what the Christmas record from the period looked like. Jolly Christmas from Frank Sinatra. This is an original, so and I will finish, because we have passed 1 hour, with his last record that was released under Capitol Records, which was a record called Point of No Return. What had happened at this point is that he had gotten into a fight. Again, he got into fights with everyone, but he had gotten into a fight with the head honchos at Capitol Records at this point, and started to say, fuck it, I'm fed up of having other people tell me what to do, so what I want to do is I'm going to start my own record label, and I have creative control of everything. Nobody can tell me shit anymore. And his first attempt at doing that type of thing, really exercising full control of every part of his career from the recording perspective and publishing perspective, was he attempted to buy Verve Records from Norman Granz. And as far as I know, they had an agreement in place too, but it's just something that never came to fruition. So once upon a time, Verve Records was supposed to become the property of Frank Sinatra. What wound up happening instead is that he founded his own record label called Reprise Records. Lots of Reprise Records. Neil Young recorded tons of stuff there. And he used that as a launching pad for another huge part of his career. The Vegas years, really, the Vegas sound really starts taking hold a lot during the Reprise years, but I guess I'll save that for another time. But yeah, I knew it would take a long time. This was a lot of fun to talk about, but that's the first two major periods of Frank Sinatra's catalog. The first, Tommy Dorsey, which lasted a short period of time, he recorded with RCA Victor. Not stuff you're going to find a whole lot of, and it's definitely not the quote-unquote popular stuff, although the first versions of a lot of staples, Sinatra staples, did start there. Columbia years is where the Bobby Sox era really, really starts getting big. That's the Teen Idol era of his music. Again, not the huge stuff. And then we really get into the cream of his music, which I consider the Capitol years. In that case, I think all of it is good, and you should own all of it. And his Reprise years, I guess we will save for another time. There are a whole bunch of stories there. There's so much more to talk about. There really is. I hope you guys enjoyed the show, man. If you did, give me a thumbs up. Subscribe to the show. Let's hear it from the comments. Did I miss anything? Share if you like it. It's an easy payment, isn't it? Tune in next week. Friday, or no, sometime next week, we're working on a jazz show with Matt Block of Run Out Groove. Some really good stuff to talk about. I hope it happens. And the gift show. The gift show is definitely going to happen, because I don't have to rely on anybody. And the stock is coming in. So we'll be talking about headphones and cleaning machines and brushes and all sorts of good stuff. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, guys. Have yourselves a swell